I define environmental justice pretty strictly. I follow the EPA's definition, which is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in the environmental decision-making process. I don't go much deeper than that because I'm not trained as a social scientist, and I want to make sure that everything I say and everything I purport environmental justice to be is supported by experts who spend a lot of time thinking about it. You know, I can go into examples, and I think that we will, but that's where I start to offer some of my own insights are in the details. About 4 or 5 years ago, the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs formed an environmental justice committee, and they asked me to be a part of it. We collectively sat down and started thinking about what that committee would look like and what kinds of things it would do. In the beginning, issues of equity and institutionalized racism were not obvious things that jumped out at us. But the more we learned about issues that are facing American Indian communities in North Carolina, the more we realized that some of these things, perhaps not deliberately, really do target indigenous peoples in disproportionate ways. Yeah, so the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is an environmental justice issue in a couple of different ways. First off, when we think about the policies and procedures that regulators are supposed to follow and abide by during the decision-making process, they're held to a standard. There's an executive order from the 1990s that says that all federal agencies have to assess whether or not their actions, they could be permits, they could be policy decisions, do these actions disproportionately affect poor or minority people in the United States. So they have to identify when those disproportionate impacts occur, and to the best of their ability, they have to address them. That to the best of their ability part is a big loophole, which means that they really don't have to do anything, but they don't get a free pass when it comes to identifying the impacts. So in the case of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, there's a structural impact from the very beginning that stems from the fact that regulators never acknowledge that indigenous peoples are disproportionately targeted by the routing of this pipeline. The second issue kind of flows from that. While they're preparing the environmental reviews, regulators are on the hook to give a comprehensive assessment of all the environmental impacts of this project. If you have a group of people who are acutely affected by a project and you haven't acknowledged that they're there, then you can't really assess the specific environmental impacts that community cares about. So it's not just you didn't follow the rules, but the fact that they didn't follow the rules left a big gap in the knowledge that they use to make decisions. So the environmental justice issue emerges again in that when the agency issued its decision, it issued a decision in the absence of information about some of the people who are most affected by the project. Yeah, we know that climate change is going to have, on the whole, negative impacts on society in general. But one of the other things that we know is that those negative impacts aren't equitably distributed across the world. You're going to have certain regions of the world and certain sectors of the society that are impacted more than others. In the United States, those impacts are going to be worse in places that overlap geographies where we have large numbers of minority populations and where we have large low-income populations. So these are populations that, one, have been historically left out of the decision-making process. They often contributed less than the average amount of share of greenhouse gas emissions based on their economic status. Yet they're going to be bearing the brunt of climate change impacts. That could be extreme heat. It could be high energy bills that come with having to heat and cool your poorly insulated home. It could be health impacts because you have an outdoor job that requires a lot of manual labor in hot weather. If you're a farmer, you will have reduced agricultural productivity because of climate change. So all these factors conspire to put a larger than average share of the climate change burden on poor and minority communities in the United States. Yeah, so early on, American Indian tribes and organizations within the state weighed in. So there was a public comment period, and a handful of tribes and other organizations wrote to federal regulators and said, hey, you left us out of the draft environmental impact statement. We're not even mentioned in this document, yet there are something like 30,000 American Indians who live within the study corridor. That's a quarter of all the American Indians in North Carolina and 1% of all the indigenous peoples of the United States in this narrow little strip of land that runs from West Virginia to North Carolina. So people were pretty upset that they had been left out of the draft environmental impact statement, and they asked the regulators to formally engage with their tribal governments before that document was finalized. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. The agency instead asked the developer to go and have discussions with tribal governments without any explanation of how that information might be used or what the obligations were for the developer to report back objectively to the regulator. These are some of the reasons why formal consultation doesn't involve the developer as an intermediary. You want to have direct conversations between the decision maker and the affected community. And in the end, what happened was the developer submitted a report that didn't really articulate the key concerns that tribal communities had. So when that process didn't work, tribes issued resolutions that called on decision makers to rescind permits that had been granted without giving weight to indigenous perspectives. Unfortunately, none of those resolutions were answered by state or federal regulators. There was a civil rights complaint to the EPA that involved environmental justice that a number of parties filed on behalf of poor and minority communities in North Carolina and Virginia. While that case was being adjudicated, the pipeline lost other federal permits, and so the Civil Rights Office said, we can't evaluate a case that's not imminently threatening your communities. So since they've lost their permits, we're going to kick this civil rights case out, and you can come back later if they get their permits in a row and start threatening you again. You can renew your civil rights case. There were a couple of tribes who joined the civil rights case in North Carolina. So this is to say that indigenous peoples in North Carolina have worked through their own tribal governments. They worked through other organizations to try and inject their voice during the regulatory process, and now again during the legal process, because now that the regulators have ostensibly washed their hands of this project, it's all in the federal courts. And so that's kind of where things are right now. In terms of on-the-ground protests, we haven't seen anything like the gatherings that we saw of water protectors at Standing Rock. And I'm not claiming that would happen with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. That was a very unique, singular moment in history where a lot of things converge, and it was led by a core of indigenous youth who were very committed to protecting their not only their water but also their tribal sovereignty and their treaties. And so the dynamics are very different here in the Southeast than in the Plains, and it remains to be seen what, if anything, might happen in terms of direct action by indigenous peoples or others. So it turns out that regulators are using specific kinds of demographic tests to determine whether or not there are poor or minority communities that are disproportionately concentrated within study areas. Those tests, frankly, don't work. They're not sensitive to the people that the test most needs to identify. So the test just doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because it doesn't appear to be a test that was developed by social scientists or demographers. It doesn't have there's no well-cited history to this test. It just kind of appears in environmental impact statements in the past. And so it sort of makes its way from one environmental impact statement to another. And nobody's ever taken a critical look at it before. Lots of social scientists have pointed out, hey, on a case-by-case basis, you missed a community with this project. You didn't detect a disproportionately large minority population with this project. You missed something here. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that it doesn't work, but I hope the work that I'm doing is showing from like a systematic and a mathematical basis why this thing doesn't work. So the simple answer is they need to stop using that test, and there are lots of other metrics that they can use to help guide their decision making. They also need to get comfortable with the fact that a mathematical test is not going to make a decision for them. They're called decision makers for a reason. Those tests are sort of like a dashboard to give them the lay of the land. But when it comes down to it, people need to get out in the field, walk these sites in the same way that we can't do wetland assessment and regulation for the Clean Water Act just sitting at a computer terminal. People get paid lots of money to go out and walk around wetlands and hang little flags and measure it with their GPS. We don't do anything like that when it comes to measuring the impacts of projects on human communities. Rarely do people go out and survey households or things like this in the field. So I think we need to move more to a model of doing fieldwork to support environmental justice. So one of the tenets of environmental justice, and this is where I get to offer my interpretation, and it goes a little deeper than how the EPA defines it. One of the tenets of environmental justice is giving voice to people who are traditionally left out of the decision-making process. So if you're going to use analyses and tests and data sets that are stacked against the identification of these communities from the get-go, you are perpetuating a history of suppressing their voices. So we need to turn up the sensitivity of our tests in a way that amplifies these particular voices because they have been left out of the process for far too long, and it's time to have a seat at the table. Yeah, so in terms of environmental justice generally, I think that young people need to know what our current policy landscape is, and that policy landscape is pretty fragile. All of our environmental justice policy is based on a federal executive order. There is no federal or state law that deals with environmental justice. So as current generation of students grows into leaders of tomorrow in society, are they comfortable with this ethic and this policy being based on something as fragile as a federal executive order? Or will they insist that we have stronger protections? We could go back a couple of generations and think about people who advocated for the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act or these other landmark environmental laws. Could we have something like that with environmental justice? And will this generation of young people be the ones to finally push that into law? For the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, particularly, I think the most important thing to remember is that it's still not a done deal. People aren't happy with the way that environmental justice issues have or have not been addressed with this project, there is still the potential for recourse, either through supporting some of these court actions, through talking to your decision makers, your elected representatives, or talking directly to the energy companies that are developing this project, letting them know how you feel about the environmental justice proposition associated with that pipeline. I think it's also important to talk about the climate implications of that project. We often talk about shale gas as being a cleaner alternative to coal, but let's zoom out and put that in perspective. Coal, we find, is like the absolute worst way to generate electricity if we're interested in sustainability and not having a runaway climate. Only one or two steps above that in the pantheon of all the ways to generate electricity is shale gas. So if you hear somebody say shale gas is better than coal, you're talking about last place versus second to last place. And so is that the kind of incremental improvement that we want when we're so close to this this climate tipping point? Yes, yes, it is, in all seriousness, it's something to think about, because once we pull the trigger on this project and it's built and put in the ground, these pipelines can have 50-year lifespans, right? So we're locking in all of those carbon emissions for the next half century.